And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is April the 7th, the 97th day of the year. 268 days remain to the year's over with. Holidays and observances. National No Housework Day. National Beer Day. Visit a brewery. Open up a cold one. Or, if you have an educational bent, learn how to brew your own beer. And a National Beaver Day. National Coffee Cake Day. Metric System Day. National Making the First Move Day. National IEP Writing Day. The Individualized Education Program. It's a step in tailoring education to meet the unique needs of students that have disabilities. Girl Me Too Day. National SWA Day. Enigmatic sound at the heart of linguistics. A subtle symbol of linguistic nuance and pronunciation variance. You know, not everybody talks the same. I mean, I'm from the South, and folks from the North, we don't talk funny. World Health Day. National Library Week. National Wildlife Week. Discover National Parks Fortnight. Community Garden Week. And Parkinson's Awareness Week. And Be Active, Be Healthy, Be Happy Week. Now, y'all have asked me not to go on and on ad nauseum about all the different celebrations, so I'm not. I am going to turn and talk about some stories in the news right now. The federal judge has called for deportation of a Salvadoran man in Maryland wholly lawless and wants everybody who was deported brought back. It was a 22-page decision called the deportation of Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia of El Salvador lawless. And after an appeals court on Monday denied a motion from the Department of Justice to stay the judge's order to bring him back, the Trump administration's asked the U.S. Supreme Court to get involved. He was deported to an El Salvadoran mega prison last month for being an alleged MS-13 gang member. U.S. District Judge Paula Zinnes ordered the Department of Homeland Security and Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem to return him to the U.S. He was living in Maryland. You know, these judges seem to think they are anointed by God to make their own opinions become law. Well, right now, Netanyahu has become the first world leader to meet Trump at the White House, favoring trade talks. There's of course, we got a lot of tariff fallout going on right now. Breakthrough in the House of Representatives has set the stage for major moves on the president's priorities. Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has cut a deal with the GLP rebels who paralyzed the House. Bills on non-citizen voting, judicial activism are getting votes this week. You know, if the Congress tells these activist judges to mind their own business, we might get something done. The Meghan McCain has come out in favor of stopping the trans athletes taking part in girls' sports. Al Sharpton has slammed PepsiCo over their woke push and used MSNBC airtime to boost his activism. He got $500,000 from Kamala Harris to do a softball interview. So he's, of course, got one eye on the dollars. Well, the An anonymous Epstein accuser has recanted sexual slavery claims against a movie phone co-founder. Name is Jane Doe 11. Claims Jeffrey Epstein abused her and referred her to Dr. Henry Jarecki for a mental health check. I would say somebody probably sweetened her pocket. First responders and children are among the dead from the monster tornadoes took place this weekend. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of bodies under a soccer field. Maybe as many as 150 victims. Well, according to archaeologists, they found an ancient Roman mass grave dating back to the 1st century A.D. under a soccer field in Vienna. This necropolis was found by construction crews working at the neighborhood of Simmering last October. Discovery was unknown to the world till the Vienna Museum announced it April 2nd. Let's see. Jake Tapper, Mr. CNN, denied being on the left during an exchange with Trump's agricultural secretary. He reacted quickly to a charge he's partisan. He refused to be labeled a member of the left in an interview with Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins on Sunday. Michelle Obama, the wife of President Barack, I'm anointed by God, Biden. Her podcast is ranked 34th on the Spotify podcast chart. This is weeks after debuting her first episode alongside her brother, Craig Robinson. Podcast ranked higher on Apple Podcast as the 21st podcast on the list. They launched a podcast in early March calling it IMO. Let's see what else we got. Harvard's remedial math course reignites concerns about test optional pandemic policies. If you were the right color and the right ethnicity, you got into Harvard. Well, standardized testing has been scaled back drastically, and they believe that's what accounts for what are being called skill gaps. Without any SAT or ACT scores in their application, kids without basic math skills can slip through the cracks, and school should have seen that coming. House Freedom Caucus chair urges Johnson to change course on the Senate version of the Trump budget bill. This is House Freedom Caucus Chairman Andy Harris, Republican of Maryland, said he would oppose the Senate's version of sweeping legislation to advance President Trump's agenda, voted on in his chamber this week. Also called for the House and Senate to get to work on their own versions of the plan. Well, Minnesota currently has 12 sanctuary counties that limit cooperation with ICE to deport undocumented immigrants. But a group of 5 Minnesota sheriff's offices signed cooperation agreements with ICE. There's an illegal alien who, during the demonstrations this weekend, which were paid for, I understand, by Soros and his group, but this anti-Trump activist boasted about being undocumented, unafraid, and queer at the rally. It was the anti-Trump hands-off rally, and name was Grisa Martinez Rojas, longtime left-wing immigration activist. Told those in attendance at the Washington, D.C. demonstration over the weekend She wasn't afraid of nobody. Well, poor American husband and his wife became farmers. Reveal how their product aligns with healthy living goals. They're farmers in New York. Say Americans come to find out where their food comes from. They were living in Florida in 2020 when they were visiting family on Long Island, New York, decided to buy a farm on a whim. It was their little COVID experiment. Well, program called Sound of Freedom. It says AI tools helped nab a child trafficker that had avoided the FBI for 10 years. The FBI agents I've associated with down here would have made the Keystone cops look bad. Well, yeah, let's see what else we got. Oregon City, at the center of a U.S. Supreme Court ruling on homeless encampments, is as bad or worse shape than it was before the decision. That's according to a man who runs the area's only overnight shelter. It's Grants Pass, Oregon. They've been described as an exercise in how not to handle things. It's a city of about 40,000 residents. The Supreme Court ruled last summer that Grants Pass could stop homeless people from sleeping in public parks and in the streets. Okay, let's see what else we got. Well, a lot of the talking heads on TV believe that they know better than the president how the country ought to be run. And CBS Margaret Brennan asked Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick whether AI was involved in designing President Trump's broad tariff policies. And they went head to head. Because, of course, being a television presenter makes her smarter than anybody else. The Ricardo Medina Jr., the Red Lion Wild Force Ranger of the Power Rangers, been called a madman, got away with a fatal stabbing. It was Joshua Sutter, who was stabbed with a sword by his roommate. Israel has denied entry to two British lawmakers accused of planning to spread anti-Israel hatred. They're U.S. Representatives Rashida Tlaib of Michigan and Ilhan Omar of Minnesota in 2019. Now, the two British lawmakers who were accused of planning to spread anti-Israel hatred were two Labour members of Parliament, Yal Yang and Abdeslam Mohammed, briefly detained over the weekend and denied entry to Israel because they allegedly had plans to document the activities of security forces and spread anti-Israel hatred. Well, of course, these people all know better than anybody else what everybody ought to be doing because they're elected officials. They're geniuses. Okay. Well, coming up is The 10 plagues of Egypt, which were described in the books of Exodus, have been downplayed by scientists, saying all this is impossible. Well, there's been a lot more researching going on. We have Easter coming up in less than 2 weeks. And, growing up, I've heard arguments, they happened, they didn't happen, they couldn't have happened. But the 10 plagues, as outlined in the book of Exodus, was the Nile River and all bodies of water in Egypt turning to blood, killed all the fish and made the water undrinkable. Then the second one, frogs swarmed throughout the country, even got into homes and bedrooms. The third one were gnats or lice covered the land, tormenting the Egyptians. The fourth one, swarms of flies plagued the land and the Egyptians. The fifth one, livestock pestilence, a plague killed most of the Egyptian livestock. Number 6 was boils. Painful boils appeared on the Egyptians and their livestock. The seventh one, severe storm of hail destroyed crops and other vegetation. Number 8, a massive swarm of locusts devoured the remaining crops and vegetation. Ninth one, 3 days of total darkness covered the land. And finally, number 10, the death of every firstborn child in Egypt, including the Pharaoh's son, led to the Israelites leaving the country. Now, there are a lot of questions about whether or not they really happened. And there are a number of theories. And when the Passover holiday begins, evening of April 15th in 2022, and also Passover will begin here. Let me confirm that date. Let's see. Well, Jewish people around the world celebrated by retelling the biblical story of the Exodus from Egypt, including the 10 plagues that God inflicted on the ancient Egyptians. And as the Passover story tells it, after Pharaoh refused Moses' entreaty to let the enslaved Israelites go free, God sent a series of 10 plagues to pressure the Egyptian ruler. And each time, Pharaoh promised to free the Israelites and then reversed his decision when the plague was lifted until the very last one. Now, the question of whether the biblical stories can be linked to archaeological discoveries is one that has long fascinated scholars. And the 10 plagues, of course, are no exception. And over the years, scientists have been curious about whether the story of the plagues may have been based on some event that could be proven to have happened. And there are 3 major theories that have come to pass. There's the volcanic eruption. This theory argues that the plagues are really the fallout of volcanic eruptions on the island of Santorini in the south of Greece about 1620 to 1600 BC. Microbiologist Cyril Trevisanotto, author of The Plagues of Egypt, Archaeology, History, and Science, Look at the Bible, argues ancient Egyptian medical texts support the idea. Now, winds would have carried the ash to Egypt at some point over the summer, and the toxic acid in the volcanic ash would have included the mineral cinnabar, which would have been capable of turning a river a blood-like red color. Accumulated acidity in the water would have caused frogs to leap out and search for clean water. Insects would have burrowed eggs in the bodies of dead animals and human survivors, which generated larvae and then adult insects. And then the volcanic ash in the atmosphere would have affected the weather, with acid rain landing on people's skin, which in turn would have caused boils. The grass would have been contaminated, poisoning the animals that ate it. Humidity from the rain and subsequent hail would have created optimal conditions for locusts to thrive. And volcanic eruptions could also explain the several days of darkness, which would account for 9 plagues. Then there's the ancient Egyptian account of the children of aristocrats lying dead in public and archaeological data matching the account. According to Travasanato, amid all the destruction, firstborn children would have been sacrificed out of desperation in the hopes that such a meaningless sacrifice would lead their gods to stop punishing them. Then there's the red algae theory, put forth by scientists like John Marr, an epidemiologist who wrote a 1996 journal article featured in the New York Times. He wrote that red algae could have sucked oxygen out of Egyptians' waterways, killed the fish, and turned the water red. And just as in the volcano theory, frogs would have leapt out looking for food and died. Without frogs to eat the insects, the pests proliferated and feasted on corpses, a feeding frenzy for flies and locusts. And Marr's article argued the lice could have been a type of insect called Culicoides, which can carry 2 diseases that would explain the livestock death: African horse sickness and blue tongue. The boils on humans would have been caused by glanders, an airborne bacteria disease spread by flies and tainted meat. According to this theory, the darkness is coincidentally caused by a sandstorm. Darkness would have left the crops, whatever crops were left after the other problems, mold in. The mold would have produced airborne toxins that might explain widespread childhood death. Then, of course, the always popular fallback, climate change. This addendum to the algae theory points out that for red algae to flourish in the first place, there needs to be a slow, sludgy, warm water. 2010, research on stalagmites, elongated mineral deposits that form out of calcium and precipitation, suggests that there had been a dry period towards the end of the rule of Pharaoh Ramses II. And this change would have dried up the Nile and significantly slowed down the flow of water, according to paleoclimatologist Augusto Mangini. These conditions are ripe for the growth of the bacterium Oscillatoria rubescens, which more colloquially burgundy blood algae, according to biologist Stefan Flugmacher. But if you ask anybody who celebrates Passover, and they're likely to say the question of whether scientists can prove the plagues really happened in ancient history is irrelevant to the holiday. According to Jerusalem-based Rabbi Jonathan Nero, to him it doesn't matter whether scientists are able to find a historical basis for something that happened around 3,500 years ago. Central message is that God brought the plagues on Egypt in order to free the Israelite slaves. God was teaching the ancient Egyptians a lesson about justice, he says, and that they refused to do the right thing and free the Israelites, they suffered the consequences. Well, Nero, as the co-founder and executive director of the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, does say that science has a key role to play in how the story of the plagues is told and received today. That's because he actually sees another lesson in it, one for the era of man-made climate change. Pollution of ancient Egypt's water echoes water pollution and water scarcity issues today. Frogs with their very sensitive skin are an indicator species, meaning that their suffering is seen by scientists as a mark of a larger imbalance in society around them. According to Norell, the Egyptians were very happy to have a free source of labor in the form of Israelite slaves, and when God said this needs to stop, they were reluctant to change. And fossil fuels in the last 150 years have replaced slave labor as the key driver of human society. Pharaoh within us that wants to continue to do something that's not right. Keep in mind, if you will, that the 10 plagues found in the book of Exodus also known as the plagues of Egypt. They're a cornerstone of religious belief. And in regard to the death of the firstborn, one of the other things I read was the firstborn was the most beloved of the parents, and they usually got double portions. But if the grain had turned to mold, the mold itself would have killed them. In fact, I learned the hard way, mold can actually cause strokes. Anything that disrupts the normal processes of society can cause major issues. You need to keep in mind that Egypt, like many of the countries along the Nile, everything centered around the ebb and flow of the water in that river. Anything that affected it affected the country as a whole. And the plagues were a succession of apocalyptic calamities. And of course, something that widespread could only have been sent by God. And according to a number of other things, the Egyptians worshiped multiple gods. They had a pantheon of gods. It was said to be a war of God against the gods of Egypt and what they symbolized and what they stood for in the Egyptian culture. Ancient Egypt was the greatest kingdom in the world, the greatest ever witnessed because of this. Its gods were believed to be ultra-powerful. And their religion and cults were complex, and its gods were involved in virtually every aspect of culture. And the plagues that God sent against Egypt, they weren't random events, they were direct attacks on the gods of Egypt. A holy war, if you will, of God against the gods of Egypt, demonstrating his supremacy and even the ability to control the aspects of the physical world that the Egyptians believed belonged to their gods. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, God said, I'll pass through the land of Egypt this night and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both men and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I'll execute judgment. I am the Lord. And that's the night of the 10th plague when the firstborn died. And looking at the plagues again from this point of view, turning the Nile River to blood was an attack on Khnum, creator of life in the Nile, Happy, god of the Nile and fertility and fish, and Osiris, whose little bloodstream is believed to be the Nile. The second plague, overwhelming frogs, was an attack on Hecate, goddess of fertility, generation, and birth. She had the head of a frog, and charms using her image were used to promote fertility and magic rites. The third plague, the lice, the gnats, and the biting insects that strike on Geb, the god of earth and habitable lands. The Egyptians believe insects sprouted from the soil, and bad soil created these terrible and annoying creatures. The fourth plague was an attack flies. It was an attack on Wadjet, goddess of the marshes and dog flea. The flies were just annoying little flies, were bloodsuckers, and this goddess supposedly kept them at bay. Fifth plague was sick cattle and livestock, was an attack on Hathor, the fertility goddess, the one that had the head of a bull. The sixth plague, boils, was a strike against Sekhmet, goddess of disease and healing. and Isis, goddess of health, and some say Imhotep, the demigod of medicine. The seventh plague, thunderstorms of fire and hail, was an attack on Nut, the goddess of the sky, and Set, the god of thunderstorms, and Shu, the god of the air and supporter of the sky. The eighth plague was locusts. That was against Osiris, who was the ruler of the crops, and Nepit, the god and goddess of grains. The ninth plague was the darkness, was a strike against Ra, the most revered god of the sun, as well as Atum and Khepri, all representing different aspects of the sun, and Horus, whose eyes represented the bright light in the sky with his right eye of the sun, and the left was the moon. And, of course, the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, was an attack on all 2,000 gods of the Egyptians, who all were involved in life and death and the afterlife. Most importantly, though, it was a strike on the Pharaoh himself, was believed to be a living god upon the earth. This plague showed he wasn't immune to the power of the Israelis' God, And as I said, in hindsight, the plagues upon Egypt were a warrant upon the gods of Egypt to show God's people which God it was that actually reigned supreme. And if you understand the plagues this way, it explains a lot, like the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. First 5 plagues of the Bible says Pharaoh hardened his heart. As the plagues continued, Moses told Pharaoh repeatedly, let the people go. He gave warning this wasn't going to end well. But Pharaoh chose to bring further judgment upon himself and thus the nation that he's a living God of by hardening his heart. But things begin to change with the 6th plague. Well, that, some folks have reacted to earlier stories I've done by sending me more information. For example, Pearl Harbor. The readers of the New Yorker got more than writing and funny comics the magazine was famous for when they opened their magazines, November 22nd, 1941. A series of ads scattered throughout the magazine will go down in infamy. Some called them bizarre coincidences, some called them eerie predictions. Some said they were diabolical coded messages to enemies preparing for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, a few weeks before the bombs rained down on American soil, the peculiar advertisements contained an ominous and prescient bit of copywriting. One ad read, Achtung, warning, alert. We hope we never have to spend a long winter's night in air raid shelter, but we're just thinking. It's only common sense to be prepared. If you're not too busy between now and Christmas, why not sit down and plan a list of things you want to have on hand? And though it's no time really to be thinking of what's fashionable, we bet that most of your friends will remember to include these intriguing dice and chips, which makes Chicago's favorite game the Deadly Double. Now, the smaller ads are more intriguing. Small blocks feature drawings of dice with the numbers 12 and 7 prominently displayed on the dice and facing toward the reader. And the copy, of course, referred the reader back to the main ad. Rumor has it intelligence officers never noticed the obscured ad before the attack on Pearl Harbor, but it certainly was brought to their attention soon after. According to the story, they sent an investigator to the officers of the New Yorker to find out who placed the ads, but it was strictly a cash deal. No name, no address, really no product being advertised. And the investigation died. Well, scattered throughout the issue were 6 smaller ads referring back to the main ad with the dice numbered 12 and 7, numbers on no known dice. Later, during the war, Navy transport pilot Joseph Bell was flying a South Pacific route when one of his passengers, an intelligence officer, told him a lot of folks in intelligence considered this ad a secret warning. He'd been assigned to investigate the matter, but every lead had led to a dead end. The ad's copy had been presented in person to the magazine's offices, and all the fees were paid in cash. Neither the game offered in the ad nor the company that purported to make it ever existed. Well, the intelligence officers are convinced the ad was nothing more than a coded message to other Japanese intelligence operators in the country of a pending attack. Maybe it was a way to warn them the attack was imminent and they should prepare to flee the country. Well, after the war, though, the wife of the man who placed the ad supposedly stepped forward and claimed the weird copy wasn't a coded message to Japanese agents, but it was trying to drum up interest in a board game the man is trying to sell nationwide. Copies references to bombings and the ominous dice with the numbers 12 and 7 staring out at the readers was nothing more than an odd coincidence. Well, while paranormal theorists have no trouble believing the advertiser wasn't an agent of the Japanese military, they do believe the man may have been an agent of a much deeper, more pervasive force. The power of synchronicity. Based on Jung's theories, synchronicity is a causal connection between events, which is often called coincidence. But the perceiver recognizes a deep meaning between the events. It's more meaningful than the quirky but random events that we all typically call coincidence. For instance, clock stopping at the exact time a loved one passes away, and when you're looking at a person's picture on your phone and they call you. According to Jung, we're all connected to a much larger form of consciousness, something he called the collective consciousness. That often reveals itself in unpredictable ways and often uses symbols to transmit its messages. Certainly, Jungians can see the dice, the ultimate symbol of fate, as a message that could suggest something like an imminent attack that would dramatically change the course of the country's history. This overmind, as some other philosophers refer to the collective consciousness, sits outside of space and time. Can reveal hidden things of the past. Ghosts might be an example of this and offer glimpses, although veiled glimpses, into the future. For people who favor the paranormal explanation, the Pearl Harbor synchronicities are an indication that the marketer had tapped into this field. He connected two things: advertisements for his game and the premonition of the future attack. Or maybe more accurately, he served unconsciously as the medium for the synchronistic connection. He, of course, had no idea the symbols he used, the 12 and the 7, along with the violent warlike imagery, were a deeper message, a warning, if you will. That the message went unheeded is perhaps not the point. The mystery of synchronicity is not to warn somebody to change their actions, it's to alert them to the presence of a deep connection between them and the universe. If that's the case, the mission of the Pearl Harbor synchronicity, which had intrigued World War II history buffs and paranormal enthusiasts alike, was certainly accomplished. Well, there are many, many stories of similar things that appeared in hindsight to be warnings. Yesterday we talked about haunted hospitals, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. Yeah, we ran out of time. We were talking about Clark Air Base in the Philippines. And the hospital, of course, is very well known. Now, ghost stories centered around this hospital are not restricted to the 21st century. In fact, doors appearing to open of their own and disembodied voices and ghostly apparitions bearing wounds and injuries were all talked about by some of the staff during the years when the Clark Air Base Hospital was still a working medical facility. It's difficult to legitimately visit the hospital today, and depending on what you believe, it's either because of a number of violent and frightening paranormal incidents that have befallen unwary visitors inside, or because of the health and safety hazards of walking around a building that's basically falling apart. Security guards still patrol the area and have no hesitation in turning away the unauthorized visitor. One organization that has no trouble in getting authorized access is the Atlantic Paranormal Society, or TAPS. 2007, investigators from the sci-fi TV series Ghost Hunters International flew to Angeles City in order to conduct an overnight investigation of the old Clark Air Base Hospital. The reason given for their visit was that security guards were too scared to enter the building due to disembodied voices and screams, the crying of babies, and even seeing full-body apparitions. The show offers an interesting look inside the old ramshackle building. Introduced to the same security guard who would later meet with Robert Joe, the ghost hunters were shown the exact same spot at which guards claimed to have encountered the faceless male apparition that asked for a cigarette from him. A pair of hospital custodians then go on to recount the story of yet another faceless man who approached them when they were going about their duties on an appropriately dark and stormy night. At least he appeared to be faceless at first glance. When the pair finally got a look at where his face should have been, instead they saw he had only a skull. No face. It apparently had the investigation started before the ghost hunters started to see mysterious flashes of light on the darkened walls and ceilings of the abandoned old building's basement. Lights would also show up on the crew's video recordings during their brief final debrief. Footsteps are heard at the far end of an empty corridor, and when the team goes down there to investigate the source, 3 knocks are heard, coming out of nowhere. Footsteps immediately cease. A line of graffiti scrawled on one of the walls said, "Beware of ghost." And that certainly seemed like sound advice. Elsewhere in the building, 2 other investigators, surprised by the sound of a disembodied whisper that seems to originate somewhere in the air between them, followed by the sighting of a face in one of the darkened corners of the room. Needless to say, a search revealed nobody physically lurking in the area. Same visual manifestation of face in the darkness and appears to the first 2 investigators as well. Shortly before one of them experiences the frightening sensation of his ear being grabbed by an unseen force of some kind. And suddenly their noises all around the investigators in the basement. One of the ghost hunters said it was like a whole troop of people surrounding us. Cacophony of noise, all of it from sources unknown. The white figures fleetingly glimpsed, lurking behind one of the structural support pillars before swiftly ducking back out of sight. Exactly the same location from which staff members have also reported seeing a ghostly white apparition. And wrapping it all up, the ghost hunters reveal they've successfully recorded what sounds very much like humans screaming on their audio equipment, originating in a visibly empty corridor. That's just another twist in the fascinating tale that's the hauntings of Clark Air Base Hospital. Shortly after this, the TAPS team packed up their gear to head to another location on their world tour. But the part of that trip that was seen on TV would turn out to only be part of a much darker story. According to a TAPS team member regarding this episode of the show, he was described by the interviewers as an intelligent, thoughtful man, obviously giving a great deal of thought to what took place in the abandoned hospital building. He said, unfortunately, we didn't have the opportunity to research the entire base and surrounding area. We focused purely on the hospital building itself, and the old Clark Air Base Hospital is one of the few locations where he said he never wanted to go back. Not because of what's going on the upper floors, but because of what he found in the basement. So a seasoned, highly regarded ghost hunter considered the location to be so haunted, he would never wanted to set foot there again. Well, the question became, what did they unearth in the basement? He said, I remember we headed down to the basement. I was with Dustin Parry, and their cameraman was an individual named Snapper. All moving with great caution. The hospital itself was an exceptionally dangerous building. It's actually a death trap. He and the ghost hunter dashed the crew encountered gaping holes in the floors and all levels of the building, which led straight down to the depths of the basement. And groping blindly about in the dark, it'd be far too easy for an unwitting team member to follow several stories to their death on the hard-packed floor below. And as if the potential for a lethal fall wasn't enough, Barry related that an anaconda had taken up residence in the disused elevator shaft, ready to greet any unaware visitor who might be foolish enough to open the lift doors. It had already been a close call when the team first made their way toward the hospital, as a snake had lunged at one of the directors while the group was tramping their way through the long grass. Fortunately, the director narrowly avoided being bitten. But the rooms and corridors leading to the basement were infested with bats. The Ghost Hunters International team made good use of a bat detector. Bats and some other animals make use of a technique called ultrasound echolocation, sending out waves on a specific frequency in order to help them navigate. And a bat detector is an ultrasonic device that interprets those waves and turns them into a sound that humans can hear. Making their way into the underground chamber, Barry and his colleagues were listening to the sounds made by the nesting bats. He said they must have come across a few faulty bats, because every so often one would smash into one of our chests and backs as we continued to make our way through their home territory on the way to the basement. But as the investigators reached the basement, silence surrounded them. He said everything was absolutely quiet. He said, I remember thinking, now what's going on? There's another hole that took us even deeper into the real subterranean section, a huge hole that went down beneath the actual foundations. He found what took place next to be difficult to put into words, but he attempted to do it anyway. He said, Dustin and I started to try and communicate, searching for the best way to describe the experience. And something started to grow. And then a well started to bubble up inside and said, look, something's not right here. And he said that before the footsteps started, before everything started falling apart, the only way he could describe this, like standing in a living hell. And he said the basement of Clark Air Base is a living hell, or at least that's what it felt like at the time. He wanted to know what was caused such a strong feeling, and he said what was permitting that, I have no idea. No, for certain it wasn't attributable to the things we had on the upper floors. The communication with spirits took place up there. This was completely different. He said the Ghost Hunters International colleagues used a device familiar to military personnel all over the world in order to try and communicate with any restless souls of the armed forces that might still haunt the old hospital. He said, I found myself thinking, what's the one thing that guys would respond to? He said, you have to understand that to try and reach spirit, we have to try and find some common ground. He said he spoke to the crew and got them to hand over their cigarettes, and they used them to build that bridge to those spirits. When a cigarette was offered, heard two different voices coming back. One said, I'll take that, followed by another telling us that it was too late. Well, when asked to discuss the basement, he let out a sigh before dropping his bombshell. He said this, whatever it was, didn't belong to the human realm. He said, I can remember saying to Dustin and Snapper, we need to get out of here and quick. And that's when all of a sudden the footsteps started. And whatever happened in that place still lingers today. After a pause to digest the implications of his revelations, Barry was asked whether he'd ever experienced anything similar, even remotely like it. He said, not with Ghost Hunters International, I haven't. And very rarely elsewhere. I can't speak for my teammates, but that's why Clark Air Force Base is one of the few places I'll always leave well alone and can quite happily walk away from there forever and say, I'm done. He said there are times when we as paranormal investigators take that proverbial stick and poke the sleeping bear. Those are the time when we get bitten. We should have left it well alone, and whatever's down in the basement of the old Clark Hospital is ready to bite if somebody provokes it. Well, so you have to ask yourself, what did he think was going on in the basement? Although many accounts of the hauntings at Clark Air Base seem to center around the ghost of military personnel, whatever dates dating back to the Vietnam era, even before that to World War II. Barry believes the opinion that he has is probably correct, that it's something much more sinister at work below the Crumbingham Hospital. He says, I believe this comes down to the island, to the very ground itself, rather than what's happening in the building. Something older, more primal, something much more powerful is down there. In other words, he believes that much of the paranormal activity taking place above ground at Clark can be explained by the more traditional types of hauntings. He maintains that a non-human spirit of some sort, maybe some more elemental in nature, is by far the bigger story, lurking just out of sight beneath the foundations of the former hospital. He said, we've had our fair share of dealing with this type of spirit activity around the world, not only in South Asia, but particularly here at home in Ireland. He said, I certainly wouldn't expect him to find it at Clark. But his memories of Clark Air Base weren't all bad. He remembers the local go-kart track, describing it with great enthusiasm as being potentially life-threatening. Well, in closing out with Barry, he was asked just how big a check would somebody have to write for him in order to him to go back to that hospital again. He said, I am not interested. I do not want to go back, ever. So the wheel of history had come full circle. Once again, the United States Navy and Air Force planes are flying missions from Clark runways. Most recently, P-8 Maritime Surveillance Patrol aircraft have been used to keep a watcher eye on the activities of the Chinese Navy. And the Chinese Navy is continuing to build a show of force in the region. American Marines are conducting joint exercises with their Republic of Philippines military allies. Meanwhile, the former Clark Air Base Hospital continues to fall further and further into decay and ruin, hoarding its secrets and stories. Some of those that were interviewed have called that time at Clark an almost perfect experience, with one serviceman going so far as to describe it as like it's unique. No place like it on earth. Probably the most memorable assignment of most careers. Another described it as simply wonderful. And yet others talk about a darker side, preferring to see the place as a living hell. Maybe both sides of the story are right, and the paranormal experiences that seem to plague the former hospital depended every bit on much as the observer themselves as any other factor. So for some, the base is idyllic and beautiful. For others, it's monstrous and evil. Well, it would appear, based on all reports, that the closing chapter of the Clark Air Base Hospital story has not yet been written. Now, in our next story, tomorrow, we're going to be talking about a stateside hospital. That will definitely get your attention. And we'll talk about that one tomorrow. Until then, Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great evening.